Recording. Okay, so we'll start today's session. So I'll start by saying hello, and I want to welcome and thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Conducting a LIMS Health Check. My name is Fergal Egan, and I'm an Executive Director and Client Partner in Astrix Europe. Today's presentation is brought to you by my colleagues in Astrix Europe and will feature John Edgerton, a fellow Executive Director and Client Partner, and Elise Kulapurath, Client Success Manager for Astrix Europe. But before we get into it, I'd like to take a moment and make a quick introduction to Astrix. First and foremost, we're a consulting company and our services cover strategic consulting, enterprise architecture, data strategy and governance, as well as delivery services, primarily in lab informatics as our core business for the configuration, customization, integration, validation, business analysis, and project management on all the major LIMS, ENL, ELN, orchestration, and CDS systems. We also have a growing clinical and regulatory practice supporting similar roles and projects on platforms in those areas. Additionally, we have a staffing division which places bench scientists, lab techs, medical doctors, and more within science-based companies. And we've been delivering these services for almost 3 decades and now have about 2,000 staff internationally, where 90% of our team proudly hold advanced scientific degrees, so really making us a science-based organization working with science-based companies. We have a global reach in delivering our services, and in Europe, we are headquartered in Dublin, Ireland. So that's just a little bit about who we are, but I want to transition to introducing our agenda for today. Firstly, John will present on optimal LIMS utilization, and will be followed by Anis speaking about product lifecycle upgrades, the LIMS health check itself, and our blueprint for success. As I mentioned previously, we will have some time at the end of for your questions, so please feel free to submit any queries you may have in the chat, and we will respond to these after the presentations. So John, I'll now hand over to you for the first part of today's presentation.
Thanks very much, Fergal. Can I just confirm that everyone can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, John.
Excellent, thank you, Fergal. So hello, everyone. My name's John Edgerton. I'm an Executive Director and Client Partner here at Astrix. I've been working within the lab informatics space for nearly 20 years now. I've worked at companies like LIMS, Abbott, Thermo Fisher, Brooks Life Sciences. And prior to joining Astrix, I was the Chief Commercial Officer of a lab digital assistance company called LabTwin. And at Astrix, I get to leverage all the things that I've learned over the years to help our clients navigate and understand basically the digital transformation space. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts with you today. But anyway, let's jump right into things and take a look at the first slide. So as I mentioned, I've been working in lab informatics for a while now. I got started working at a LIMS company, which was a technology that first arrived back in the 1980s. But by the time I was there, that technology was already pretty mature. And it was created originally to remove all of those paper binders that you had and help provide some level of governance to your lab data. It had sample tracking functionality, it let you build work lists, it let you record test results. And at some point, it also started including things like training records, equipment calibration. Some even had inventory even had inventory management functionality for things like reagents and stock and things like that. But at the end of the day, a LIMS sample record, it represented what I've always called a physical instantiation of a sample. It could be held, it could be moved, it could be traced, it could be tested, and you could use this sample to help generate a certificate of analysis, release a test, release a batch, and so on. So in an analytical testing and manufacturing environment, this worked pretty well. But then what about people who do R&D? And I'm not simply talking about research organizations here. I'm talking about those that manufacture things and also create new things within the same organization. So back in the day, I worked with a specialty oil products company that manufactured large quantities of different products that could be basically bought off the shelf. And they used a LIMS for that. But when one of their clients who was creating maybe a new type of machinery, and they needed to specify a new kind of oil with certain properties for that piece of equipment, or if the company just wanted to research and test a potential new offering, well, in the lab, they ended up going with spreadsheets. And they used a spreadsheet because when you're performing experiments, you're not really concerned with sample tracking, training records, or batch release, or anything like that. You're trying a lot of different combinations of things until you get the result that you're looking for. And a traditional LIMS doesn't really lend itself to that kind of work. In fact, all of that rigid, structured work kind of gets in the way of what you're trying to achieve. But back in the day, we had this problem, and at some point in the 1990s, like magic, the ELN appeared, and it was great. You could register your materials, you could plan an experiment, you could run an experiment and keep a log of different types of findings you discovered along the way. You could record your deviations, and you also had a legal system of record when it came to things like intellectual property. But the moment stuff got real, that is the moment a candidate was to start being produced, and you needed to start to track things, well, that was always the domain of the LIMS. So if you want to look at it this way, the LIMS was the king of structured data, and ELN was the king of unstructured data. And yes, they would do battle. That is, the LIMS companies would try and add some light experiment style functionality, which usually resembled some kind of spreadsheet. And that was to try and steal market share from some of the ELN folks. And the ELN folks would add some light sample tracking functionality to try and do the same. But both of these systems had a bit of an issue, and that was that more and more labs started generating more and more data, especially when you start thinking about instrument data. And around that time, the resolution of these instruments was getting pretty good. So you had this situation where you couldn't store your instrument data in your LIMS, and you certainly wouldn't store all of that data in your ELN at the time. So between about maybe 1990s to the early 2000s, the SDMS was born. And so now you could store everything from PDF SOPs to raw instrument data and save it all away for basically a rainy day. But let's face it, most people just put it in there and kind of forgot about it. So you had the LIMS for samples, you had the ELN for experiments, you had SDMS for data, and those are only really the three main systems that I'm going to highlight there. But there was, of course, things like training management systems, inventory management systems, and a whole host of other acronyms. If you were manufacturing, you probably had SAP thrown in there as well. Nowadays, you also have environmental monitoring systems like MODA, also where ELN and LIMS falls down, I think, sometimes is when you're trying to guide a user through the actual steps to take in the workflow. So now you have LES and MES systems thrown in there as well. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the problem there, right? This really has gotten out of hand. Many different systems made by many different vendors. Many of them are crucial to an organization's ability to function properly. So if we look at the next slide, so like everything in a free market economy, when there's a problem, a solution magically arrives with a price tag. And this is where you started to see the rise of the monolithic systems, particularly the monolithic LIMS. So what do I mean by this? I mean, those Swiss Army knife systems that do LIMS sample tracking type functionality. It has SDMS, it has a bit of ELN and MES thrown in there. It handles training records, equipment calibration, inventory management, environmental monitoring, skip lot testing, you name it, it's all in one, it's all in there. So no longer do you need to worry about all of these different acronyms. You just buy one solution, you forget you ever had a problem, right? Wrong, or who knows, but in reality, it's actually dependent upon the client's situation. And there are a lot of benefits to this approach, really, if you look at it, in that everything is integrated. People are trained in one system, you get one support number to call. On the surface, it's actually quite like a safe decision, if you think about it like that. But the downsides to this approach, of course, arise from the risk of having all of your eggs in one basket. The systems tend to be quite slow and bloated, especially back then. The kind of functionality that you had was essentially at the mercy of the single vendor that you were buying from and their product roadmap and their vision for that roadmap. Once you're tied in, you're not really going anywhere. You're not moving to a new system anytime soon. The vendor knows this, you know it, your dog knows it. Many of those one-size-fits-all solutions didn't actually fit you perfectly. And so you had to customize them anyway, and that kind of made them a bit of a monster. When you called the support line, you would better hope that somebody that worked on your specific implementation picked up the phone because your system was custom. So heaven forbid any of those employees left that company. I've actually seen firsthand customers poaching staff from their LIMS vendor because of how crucial the solution was to their business, which is why nowadays when you look at your license agreement for a piece of lab informatics technology, there's some non-solicitation clauses in those things. And finally, when your system gets too old to keep running, it's a bit of a nightmare to transition your data from this proprietary system to a new one. And you always knew that. And you always knew that would end up being the case as well. What we also observe is that if you're looking to expose your data to new technologies, like we're seeing with machine learning right now, for example, we find that how your data is represented in those systems kind of prevents you from taking advantage of these new innovations. Or maybe they limit the kind of innovations that you can leverage. So when it comes to these kinds of solutions, you also have to realize that there are hundreds, if not thousands of companies all over the world that are in exactly the same situation. I mean, everybody bought these things when they came out, and the majority of companies are still running the labs on these. It's also worth mentioning as well that the new generation of monolithic systems can actually negate a lot of the old problems that were there in the beginning. Some don't even require you to actually switch on and use parts of their technology. It leaves you as the client to pick a different tool that suits that other specific piece of work that you're dealing with. But for a lot of organizations, they're still saddled with these huge systems that over time have become quite unwieldy. And the vendors they bought these systems from, they sometimes themselves have difficulty helping their clients reach the newer outcomes that they're really looking for, because they're running a very old version of their software. Maybe they're not able to utilize a new paid module of theirs that could solve the challenges because they have a heavily customized system. We see a lot of examples of this. But if we look at the next slide, for these monoliths, Astrix has world-class expertise in supporting and enhancing these kinds of systems. Even today, we're performing global rollouts of monolithic LIMS and ELMs for some of the largest companies in the world who've deemed that strategy right for them. And because we work with so many different technologies, we're able to take a step back and see the bigger picture in terms of those best practices, which is something that you don't necessarily get from a single technology vendor who may believe that their way to deploy a system is the best way, the right way. For systems that currently exist, Astrix will get sometimes brought in to run an analysis on those systems, to advise on best practices, and even help refactor some of the data that's in there. We're currently working with a very well-known organization right now whose LIMS has hundreds of thousands of methods. It's growing, they're growing that by hundreds a year. Many of these methods are repetitive, they lack version control. It makes it impossible to do any kind of meaningful reporting or BI on their data, let alone run any kind of machine learning models on that stuff. And so we're helping them understand how their data is being generated in their sites across the world, how it's being stored and used, and also helping them refactor the data that they already have that they want to keep hold of. We'll also help clients with really heavily customized solutions who've been locked out of the upgrade path of their LIMS or ELN. The company I was just referring to is one of these. By this, I mean their system got so heavily modified that they can't upgrade and use any of the new features that newer customers of that product would benefit from. And we'll cover a little bit later about how we approach projects like these. But if we look at the next slide, we find that some organizations decided to take a different path from that kind of monolithic architecture. It could be that they were already invested in one solution and so they couldn't really move, so instead bought an additional system. Or it could be that they wanted to de-risk things or cherry pick the best technologies for the different tasks they had in the lab. So what these folks did was they had separate systems, distributed systems. This gave them the best of both worlds. It gave them the best functionality for the job at hand by using dedicated technologies made specifically for that purpose. It reduced the amount of customization because you weren't trying to shoehorn in specific functionality into one system that started life as something that maybe only covered one area. And there's also a degree of resiliency in this approach too, because in certain situations, work can still continue when certain technologies are down or offline. The issue with this approach is that the complexity that is negated by having all of your eggs in one basket is actually replaced with a different complexity, a different kind of complexity, which is the complexity of figuring out how to tie these systems together. These different systems by different vendors all needing to be integrated in slightly different ways. So in addition to needing to support a number of different vendors, you're also having to support the integration mechanisms as well. And sometimes those mechanisms are varied and dependent on the technology that's actually being integrated. So a balance, and I use that as an example of what I would call a dumb instrument. And I know you've got kind of like the Sartorius Cubist balances are a little bit more high tech, but your simple balance, that will have a completely different integration mechanism than a chromatography instrument that requires maybe a more sophisticated method of integrating into your workflow. For that, you have the hardware, you have the instrument control software running on that hardware. You also have the software running on the PC that's basically sat next to that instrument. But for a balance, you're probably linking to kind of like an RS-232 port. You highlight cell, you press the print key, and the weight gets pasted into whatever cell that you're highlighting in your LIMS or ELN or other technology. It's different for the big machines like a Waters chromatography instrument that's tied to the CDS running on that linked PC that I mentioned a minute ago. This kind of thing, just like a mass spec, could be integrated to your LIMS or other similar technology using the vendor's API. That's just one way to do it. Other technologies don't have such robust ways of connecting things, and so you would have to consider maybe a custom integration or some kind of commercial middleware maybe to connect one technology to another. But the idea is that there's multiple systems to support. They're requiring any number of additional integrations to manage, whether that be point-to-point integrations, middleware, little Lantronix boxes or other variations on these. But due to the fact that Astrix works with so many different technologies and is partnered with so many different ones of these vendors, we help clients not only by performing these integrations, but our expertise after performing so many of these projects actually helps us to understand best practices around how to present a technology ecosystem like this to your users and how to get them on board with this from kind of like a change management perspective. Additionally, that broad experience allows us to formulate additional best practices around the integrations themselves to support your workflows in kind of the most seamless way. So not only can we perform these integrations, we can also take ownership of the system implementations themselves in order to deploy them in that Astrix best practice way that's cohesive with your existing informatics landscape, which is one of the reasons why clients will reach out to us after implementing different technologies in order to handle that connectivity aspect. Additionally, clients will engage with us right at the beginning of the refresh journey. That is, they're ready to replace their older ecosystem with a new one, and they want us to help them with the technology solution, their integration strategies, that kind of thing. But most of all, they ask us to consult with them on where we think things are moving to next and where the trends are going. And so if we look at the next slide, nowadays people are looking at more sophisticated ways of basically tying everything together. That's one of the trends that we've seen pick up speed in recent years. It's all well and good talking about connecting, one balance and one mass spec or even one LIMS like we did on one of the previous slides. But the truth is that many global organizations will have hundreds of instruments, and in many cases, multiple instances of a LIMS, ELN, or an SDMS or other technologies running across the organization. One client I've worked with had upwards of 9 different LIMS running globally, some in the same building, and just as many ELNs. Each had their own ecosystem of point-to-point connected instruments. They had their own ecosystem of data sources and devices, and now they're looking to get a handle on all of the data so that they can leverage generative AI technologies and try to gain insights based on the data that they're working with across those different systems. So the current trend when we look at how people are trying to solve this is via data orchestration. So these are technologies such as your Zontals, your Cyteras, your TetraSciences, or even your L7s. And there's also a few more in the mix there as well. And when I first encountered this concept, I kind of wondered how it differed from integrating everything just into your LIMS or your ELN. You know, are we not just introducing yet another thing, another acronym? And the answer, I think, lies in what you believe should be the center of your universe. And many organizations are taking the view that this center shouldn't be a closed monolith. It definitely should not be a collection of distributed, but still relatively closed systems, but instead be an open standard-based platform that would allow you to do things like access and manipulate your own data in whatever way you see fit, and to leverage this data without first having to think about how to manipulate a proprietary vendor system, and also give you a realistic way of moving from one technology to another when things start to get a little bit dated. You know, you want to be able to get a divorce. So once you take this view, you're then looking for a strategy and an underlying technology stack that handles the transport of data between systems as and when those systems actually require it. So it's all about tying together data from different sources. And most of the time, these will be things such as your ELNs, your LIMS, your SDMSs. You can see like clever instruments such as your chromatography, mass spec, NGS systems, more dumb instruments such as balances, like I mentioned before, data lakes, IoT devices and sensors generating data from your freezers, or temperature, humidity, luminosity sensors, that kind of thing, generating data from all over your labs, and a whole host of other technologies as well. And so the idea is that rather than point-to-point integrations, everything is connected to an orchestration layer. This layer handles the transport of data between systems as and when those systems require it. So once integrated to your orchestration technology of choice, your chromatography data system, for example, your CDS, can be configured to send information out to a number of different destinations, whether that's to a data lake or to whatever combination of ELN, LIMS, SDMS that you might have. Most large organizations have more than one instance of these things, so it pays to integrate a certain technology just the once, validate that, and then use that integration mechanism many times over in a consistent and supportable way. And many of these orchestration vendors have connector libraries that allow you to just plug and play things in there. Astrix has even built some of these connectors because we know how all of this stuff works and interplays with one another. What this all means is that if you wanted to start building up, say, a data warehouse, which would expose certain data sets to an AI model, you can do that. If you wanted to get at your data at any level of granularity and run it through BI tools, well, that's also possible. And you'd have the ability to do that across all of your technologies, across all of your organization, provided that they're tied into that orchestration layer beforehand. So that's all I really plan to talk about. However, we're going to go into more detail on this as the session goes on. I wanted to try and kind of give you an idea of why we are where we are right now in terms of the informatics landscape, how Astrix can help you right now, but also how we're helping people move on from all of this into a newer way of looking at things. And so now I have the real pleasure of handing things over to Anis, who will take you through what an Astrix LIMS health check entails. So thank you very much for giving me 20 minutes of your time. I really hope you found it interesting. Over to you, Anis.
Thank you so much, John. So now, since we already explored like how we can optimally utilize your system, right? So we can have a look into the product lifecycle upgrade, right? So John already mentioned some of these points, right? So in how and why we need to do this upgrades. So when we look into the product health check, or like the drivers for the upgrade, right? So mainly there are like 4 different areas that we have seen where the clients like want to go for an upgrade, right? So one, you're having a LIMS system hosted in an infrastructure or like with the system software, like which is quite outdated, right? So it's no longer being supported. You have like your Windows or your database support which has been expired, or you're having like a very old version of your LIMS software, right? So, and that's no longer being supported by vendor. So mainly like these three are like kind of like a hard driven kind of, because you don't have any choice, right? Because yeah, there is no other way. You need to immediately, you need to go for an upgrade or like change the system. In addition to this, right, some cases like when people are thinking a little bit proactively also, right, so there are new features within the new software release which you feel okay, which can add a lot of value to your landscape, right, which can be much more beneficial. So any of these drivers, like that's pretty much what it helps us or get desired, or kind of a trigger on decision of like how we go into the next phase. So what really happens, right? So what are the real benefits from an upgrade, right? So as it is quite obvious, right? So you can take advantage of your new features, new security updates. There may be like new integration functionalities, or like some of them come up with an embedded laboratory execution system, LES, functionalities, etc. Right. So in addition to this thing, right, so you may be using it like a quite older version, right? So in 2012, like you might have implemented that, and at that point of time, there are not a lot of functionalities available, right? So and you build a lot of customization or integration which has already been built. This may be already been covered in the new release, right, with an out-of-box functionality. So the customization which has been heavily been utilized can be replaced with your out-of-box functionality. There can be still, right, so you may be using a lot of paper records or logbooks which you're having, so that also can be replaced by your upgrade. So let's have a look into one of the use case we did very recently, right? So the client was using a legacy system which was heavily customized, right? So what we did was we actually had a review of the existing legacy system and the current requirements from the lab. So based on this analysis, right, so the decision was made to use new features and move on to the next feature, right, to use reduced customizations. The system was completely rebuilt without any data loss, right? So, and that's one of the key points, because the client was a bit specular on that aspect. And after the upgrade, right, so the customizations reduced by 80%, right? So you can imagine, right, so how much time it might have spent, right, to maintain those customization, or like to the cost related to that. So that has been the 80% of the customization was reduced after this upgrade. And another example, right? So we had like, so this was more like a kind of an example which John was mentioning, right? Because you don't have any choice, because the customer want to upgrade into a very, new version in a very short period of time, because the support by the vendor has been expired. So you don't have any other choice, right? But you don't have a much longer period where you can do a lot of planning. So the immediate step for what we did was like we did a technical upgrade, right? So and the client was able to use the system as before. So after the post upgrade, right, so we implemented the enhancements to use the new features, right? It was a step-by-step kind of a process, right? So, and some of the customizations were replaced by the new features, and now it's like it's still an ongoing project to make sure that the system is in line with your new lab needs. So even though the ask from the client was just to simply do the technical upgrade due to this the support issue, we were able to replace some of the customization with this new out-of-box features. So if you're deciding, right, so if you want to go to a new version, right, so pretty much this is the path you have to follow, right? And that's what we are following in-house, right? So we do have like a lot of a blueprint that has been developed for all these kind of stages within Astrix based on our experience with different clients as well as the different vendors. So pretty much it's gonna be going through the same type of channel, right? So the first and the mostly, so you need to review your current system, right? So what are the current pain points and why you have to move to a different version, right? So based on that, so it's very crucial that you need to agree on the version to which you need to upgrade to, right? It doesn't mean that you need to go to the latest version, right? Because based on your need, like the maintenance, the cost, the license cost, so there are different factors deciding it. So based on all these factors, so we decide on like which version you need to upgrade to. So once that is kind of finalized, right, so the next stage is like very crucial to ensure that so the business continuity has been happening, right? Because we need to do the planning of the upgrade, right? Because you may be having already existing maybe hundreds of users or even thousands of users currently being using that system. So you cannot simply go and upgrade and it create like some breaking functionality, right? So that's where you have to have like, okay, is it a 6 months plan, is it a 3 months plan, or like how long you need to have it? So and what are the different stages? So when the cutoff is actually happening, when is the actual validation, or like when is the actual go live is happening, how long is the hypercare period is being planned, like that. So all these things need to be done in this planning phase. And then it's like the most important part, it's like you may be already having, right? So in the previous LIMS, definitely while implementing, you may have already a risk assessment already been done, right? So now you're moving to a different stage, a different technology, or like even have additional elements, right? So you need to evaluate and assess the risk, right? So it can be technical, it can be business related, or it can be a regulatory aspect. So you need to have a complete risk assessment to be done. And based on all these factors, right? So what we do is like we prepare a rollout kit, or like kind of an upgrade kit. So this will have like all the script, right? So the technical script for the upgrade, or even for the validation script, or like the user steps or the screen steps to be done, or any kind of a channel on the communications on how we'll be approaching for the training materials. All these things will be prepared before the actual upgrade process itself. Then it's like pretty much it's a scripted upgrade process, because we might be already done the dry run and everything in your test instance or your dev instance or whatever instance we have, like which is not actually the prod. So we ensure that everything is working fine, and then we do a scripted upgrade process to ensure that there is no manual errors. So even though it is a scripted process, right, so we need to ensure that it is working as expected. So we need to do a validation. In case of GXP, we need to do IQ, OQ, all those steps, and then it's like once we confirm that, we are good to go for live. So pretty much that is mainly what we have like on an upgrade path, right? So that's a path that we usually take. So then I would like to take you to the next session on the LIMS health check, like what we have in Astrix, right? So with more like an end-to-end. So as you already know, right, so in pretty much LIMS is more like similar to the heart of your lab operations, right? So it centralize your data, ensure compliance, and optimizing the workflow. So like any human health check, right? So the LIMS health check ensures your system is really operating at a peak efficiency, right? So catching small issues before they actually become a major problem. So when you conduct like this periodic health check, right, on LIMS, so you can diagnose any performance issues at the earliest, like any bottlenecks, any inefficiencies affecting your productivity or data management. It also ensures, right, the compliance by identifying any potentially regulatory pitfall, right, as mentioned, right. So it may be, right, so you may have implemented it in 2012 or even 2002, 2005. That time the scenario might be a bit different, right? So you might not take that into consideration when you're actually ensuring the compliance part, right? So during performing this periodic health check, it ensures that it complies with all the regulatory aspect. So it assures, I mean, it also assures the data integrity aspect. And based on this, right, because when you do this kind of health check, you can anticipate any potential need of, like, I mean, for example, like the number of licenses that you're using, some of the modules that you're currently using. You may need to scale it up, or even, right, some cases you need to actually do an upgrade, right? So all these kind of things can be found during your health check. And as I was mentioning on the use case before, right, so there are a lot of customization which may be built which can be replaced by the out-of-box functionality, ultimately which enhances the user experience, right? In some cases, even the UI, right? So with an older version, so you have a different UI. You have to do, for example, a sample registration. You may have to do 5 clicks, and now it can be done by 1 click. So all these things, it's more enhancing the user experience, right? Everything can be mainly achieved while doing this periodic LIMS health check. So before we actually moving to our blueprint for the success, like, so let's have a look into LIMS health trend over the decades and the challenges the lab has faced. So over the time, right, so as you can see, right, so unintentional data silos has been created and fortified. So there have been multiple system, right, so has been purchased for similar kind of workflows and experiments within the same company, right, so making a single source of truth and understanding scientific provenance very challenging. So the integrations, right, so it can be built, like most of the cases it's either over engineered or like under engineered, mostly in the form of like point-to-point data flows, ensuring like someone, so it's really lacking of value, right? So in the maintaining, it's like it's a high cost. And as John was mentioning before, right, so the ELN and LIMS vendors has attempted to merge these capabilities into platforms, right? So with high configurability, right, so leading unfulfilled expectation, right? So what has been really expected from a LIMS, it has not been completely covered in that platform thing, right? So on top of it, right, so there were a lot of vendor mergers and acquisitions, which actually complicated the software and data landscape. The paper on glass systems were really easy and quick to deploy, right, but not really delivered on the full value of the data. So previously, right, so if you look back into some years back, right, so when we were mainly discussing about the real issues between the data warehouse, and because of that, right, so that the data lake were really introduced, and like, I mean, so is it really solve all the issues? No, but it really created new set of problems. And there were a lot of like cross industry standards, like which actually faced practical adoption challenges, right, with the real scenario. So what's really happening now, and like what is the current health of like the overall LIMS landscape, right? So most organizations have finally moved away from the paper-based notebook, right? That's been very clear. So which eliminates the need for physically cutting and pasting information into a notebook. However, right, so it's very clear that the scientists are still burdened by inefficient process for data capture and analysis. So interestingly, cutting and pasting is still happening, but just in a form of a digital way. What are the goals, right? So I mean, so we need to aim for to improve this kind of situation. So firstly, we need to make sure that our scientists are more efficient in communicating the results, right? So they can spend less time on repetitive tasks and more on the valuable insights. So organizations should also extend the impact of the data by making it accessible to geographically diverse teams. We are expecting like a significant step changes in R&D and QC productivity through deeper data analytics capabilities. But to make this really possible, right? So the results data needs to be more flexible and accessible and available beyond the systems and people that really creates the data. So let's see like some of the current industry trend around data health and AI readiness, like workflow and data orchestration platforms, practical data governance programs, improved data management technologies, and expanding use case of data like AI and machine learning. So when you look into the workflow and data orchestration platforms in the lab, right? So there are platforms right now emerging, right? So to really automate the task and workflows within your lab, and also can be as an orchestration layer among the operational and reference systems and equipments. So it really creating a kind of a no code or low code environment to configure and deploy your data flows. So some of the benefits when you look into that, right? So I mean, so it can be, right? So previously, if you see like a 5 years back, right? So when we want to do a kind of like build a new workflow or a data flow, like you need to have it as a new project as such, right? So you need to have multiple people to be involved, even if it is a small kind of a change, because it was not easily configured. But now it's like because of this flexibility among this orchestration platform, so it become very easy, right? So it can be rapidly configured like a new workflow and a data flow. There are a lot of tasks and activities. Like if you take an example of a sample registration, right? So there is a different ordering system for you, and it's like where you request for a sample, then it's like there is a team like who is receiving that, and for the inventory you're having a different system. You're doing an actual experiment on the samples, which you're doing in ELN, right? So you have a lot of duplicate of these tasks and activities where you spend a lot of time, right? So these time really we can really use that and automate a lot of tasks and activities with these workflow and data orchestration platforms. And in addition to this, right, so now you can see like a lot of out of functionalities, as well as for like John mentioned, right? So you have this orchestration layer, so where we have like more like a standardized connector, right? So you don't need to build everything from scratch. You don't need to do like point-to-point integration. So instead of that, you have your standardized connectors, your data models for many systems and instruments. So now, as you can really see, right, so it is the trend is more like going towards event-driven models. So instead of manually doing a lot of updates, so it's like, okay, once the sample has been arrived, it has been automatically reflected in multiple places, or if an equipment has been calibrated, then it's been automatically updated in multiple systems. So it's become more like an event-driven kind of a model, and people are really using like the composable API-driven lab orchestration and data integration platforms now. And you can see some of the examples, vendors which currently like people are using, like L7, Cytara, Zonta, and so on. This is not on mainly on any tool, but it's more like a kind of a organizational structure, right? So to define and enforce the business definitions, the terminologies, master data, and what's your reference data, like that. So what you can see is like now the improved data relevance and quality has been there, right? Because it's like you're defining what is your sample, what is your material, what is a lot, like you're having it. And this is one of a very important prerequisite, right? So now everyone is talking about AI, everyone is talking about ML, but without actually having a proper definition of a data, right? So you will not be able to use that. So it is a real prerequisite to be able to curate, standardize, and harmonize data for expanded use of data. So you can see a trend like within a lot of scientific organizations, there is a data governance team like which has been emerging now, like who takes care of these initiatives, and the reference and master data like becoming like more system independent. So what's really happening is like it's more like a cultural alignment and more like an internal agreement on the relationship. So what is a material, what is a lot, what is a sample, how it has been prepared, and how it has been actually been tested based on a test request or a test plan. And as you can see, it's not really dependent on any system. It's more a kind of like an oversimplification of the process. And then there are like platforms for sorting, storing, manipulating, and transporting and presenting the data, right? So it's more like a data management technologies. So more complete data of higher quality has been collected, right? So previously, like when we talk about like, so there are a lot of information currently being even captured with a very high quality, right? So more metadata has been captured, more reference data has been captured. So which is helping us to give more like a stronger data provenance. So the clear focus is mainly on the operation system, right? So when we have a look into that, so the EL and LIMS, SDMS, all those kind of systems, and the data storage, right? So previously, it's more like we were dumping everything to a data warehouse or more like a data lake, but now it's like it's been the storage and access has been very much optimized for the use. So it's a clear separation of like operation and data from the results data. So as I mentioned before, so it's more like an event-driven model, scalable multimodal data storage, etc. So when we look into the expanding use of the data, right? So right now it is mainly data used in a fit for use manner in specifically purposed application. So use of data with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. So it's mainly right now it's doing for some of the analysis and for some of the predictive analysis phase. So it's pretty much it is not a standalone one because it's like without having all the other steps and other metadata has been already been defined. So we'll not be able to achieve this. So there is a stronger data provenance and there is a clear focus on the operational system. So when we look into the trends, so iteratively, right, so it's like we are currently seeing, right, so there is an internal strong metadata structure, right? So we can call it as fair plus, whatever it is, right? So that's a kind of a trend that's currently been happening. And previously, right, so if you need to access some sort of data, right, so you need to build some sort of queries, right? So you need to have an SQL query or a Python code or like even a D360 query, something like that, to actually access the data, right? But now that's been becoming more like an enabling self-service data accessing using the language of the scientist, right? Okay, I need to have like some specific terminologies which can be easily understood by the scientist and just use it, right? And as I mentioned, so all these functionalities need to be the before, then only we can actually have it. So with the data within the right quality, then only we can actually extend that for the AI and ML phase. So now let's have a look into the Astrix blueprint to the success. So this is our digital lab of the future blueprint with all the digital transformation milestones, starting from the internal realization through the strategy, technology selection, and implementation. So pretty much most of our customers engage us starting from the strategic direction assessment, right? So where we need to evaluate where we want to achieve, right? So where we want to go, what is your current situation, so what is your future state. I will go into a bit detail of this in a later stage. Then through the technology selection, having like conducting RFI, RFPs, vendor scoring, and see like, okay, which technology can be used or multiple technologies that can be used. And then since we are partnering with many of, and we have a lot of in-house practice within Astrix on a lot of vendors and a lot of applications that we are currently being used on LIMS, EL, and different systems. So we have a team like who actually do the actual implementation and the post-go live support. So how are we actually driving or deciding or the strategic direction assessment, right? So it's like when we have to decide on how your lab to be in a future stage, right? So for the next 5 years or in the next 10 years. So once the project has been initiated, right? So we define the vision and business drivers. So why we want to really go there, right? So what is the vision of the project, right? So and the business drivers on it. Based on that, so we confirm the business and data capabilities, what is being really there in-house, what can be done, and with all this information, define a future state high-level architecture and define a strategy and a transition plan on how to reach over there. So this is a very high-level example on a guiding principle. So it can be like more like an establishing data governance, simplify the number of access points for a scientist to get their workflows completed, establish a single source of truth, or like moving towards a SaaS kind of a company. So based on this, right, so we confirm the business and data capabilities, right? So there can be like multiple groups, multiple sites, and multiple people involved doing similar kind of activities and interacting with each other. So we do like a kind of, this is an example of a group interviewed and a site map, right? So based on that, we define a high level process flow, right? So how these groups are actually being interacted, right? So and then we confirm the business and data capabilities within that. So for example, like we have like one of the difference like with Astrix, and like one of the reason why clients are reaching to us is like, since more than 90% of our team are actually holding advanced scientific background, right? So we have the basic domain knowledge, right? So if you're doing a bioprocessing, if you're doing an LMR, if you're doing an upstream, downstream process, so we already know like what all the basic flows to be there, right? So we don't need to reinvent that completely from the scratch. So instead, we can have a kind of like a predefined questionnaire for the interviews and like confirm the business needs, and we validate that with the different user groups, right? What it is actually needed, is it something that you're currently using, or like how it has been currently. So more the green, if you see, like that is more like a priority for us, like so that should be like one of the things that we definitely need to include. So similarly, you may be using multiple systems already in the lab, so which you're having a lot of pain points currently, right? So for example, like you're having, like as I mentioned before, so you need to have register one of a sample, right? So for that, how many clicks that you need to actually do, right? So this is these kind of example, and like for example, to upload an information from one specific site to another one, or like you have an instrument data that need to be transported, or like you need to have a status that need to be changed, which is taking like more than 15 minutes of time. Like, so all these kind of pain points, it can be technical, business flow. So this also we prepare a pain point heat map. So more the bread, that means it is having like more value, or like we need to focus on that, and that is one of a key selling point on like having this upgrade also, right? So for example, if you're going and talking to a scientist group where you're having like this kind of pain point, and we're going to address these things with your new update, definitely they're going to buy it, right? So it's like that's a kind of a challenge if you're going to them with an organizational change and everything, because it's with multiple systems. In addition to this, right, so you have your existing lab inventory, right? Because you may be having multiple pain points that we already highlighted, or like there are already business needs, which one of the group in a different site or in a different country is already been using that, or like they don't have that kind of an issue. So we need to understand, so what is your lab systems inventory, right? So what are the different ELN systems, what are the LIMS system, instrument connectors, which we are using for what purpose, like that we define it. And based on this, we do an assessment on this vendor, right? So we do a capabilities assessment on the vendors, right? So with multiple application that we are having, we may be adding something like, for example, from the current industry trend, we may need to utilize, okay, this vendor probably, or you may be having a legacy relationship with that company, probably, okay, we need to include them also in the evaluation kind of a phase. So based on that, so we define, like, for example, okay, we may invite 7 different vendors for an RFI, right? So where they will be evaluating this stages, they'll be presenting, they'll be doing some demo. Then based on that and scoring, right, we may be selecting 3 different vendors, right? So who can do an RFP, right? So where they'll be having in some cases a POV or like a POC kind of a phase where they implement our special use case. So we'll be already having that already been prepared. And based on that, so we select one vendor. I mean, it doesn't mean that one vendor doing everything, but it's more like, for example, workflow management, one specific vendor deployment. So it's like it's a different vendor, something like that. So right now it's moving towards more a kind of like a modular kind of an architecture, right? So based on all this information and what is the complexity of the lab and all these metrics and heat maps, so we prepare a future state high level architecture, right? So what all your reference systems being used, what all your lab systems, what is the orchestration and processing layer, the storage, reporting and analytics space, like that. So it is not about a single system, right? So it's cross system, and the base foundation for that, as we see it, right? So there is no single vendor that can be supply all the pieces necessarily. So it is pretty much as simple as that. I mean, so rather than seeing the spaghetti diagram of all the kind of instruments and like system has been connecting together, so it's a simplified version of your future state high level architecture, but it's as simple as that. But people always ask that how we gonna achieve that, right? Because yes, we know that, okay, this is where we want to reach, like how we gonna reach there, right? So that's where we define the strategy and transition plan, right? So as you can see, this is an example of a strategic plan overview. It's a living document that is reviewed and updated on a periodic basis. So it's provide guidance structure for prioritized investment decision, right? So it contain your vision, your strategic framework, your platform strategy, your data strategy, etc., etc. And based on this, you'll be having a strategic roadmap also, right? So each of these blocks that you can see, it can be its own actionable project, like selection is a project, data modeling, implementation, organizational change management. So this is how we're gonna reach the, right? So we designed or defined your future state to be landscape, and this is how we're gonna achieve that. Then it's as simple as straightforward as that. So we'll be straightly implementing those. So we have like internal practice for pretty much all the vendors which has been available currently. So Yep, so that's how we do the LIMS health check, and like how we are helping our different clients on implementing their new landscape, or like defining their strategy, doing the implementation, and like their post go live support. So that's what mainly I do have for today. So thank you so much for your patience and listening for the webinar. So I think we can move on to the questions and discussions.
Great, thanks Denise, and thanks